Your discharge lines are shaking and rattling. Do you know what it is? No, it's not the mud pump. And the pipes seem to be okay. So, what's the problem? The Pulsation Dampner. The life of your mud pump fluid end and discharge piping depends on the Pulsation Dampner. If it fails, your hard-working mud pump will beat a system to death. So, it's essential that you know the proper care and service procedures for this unit. Before we get started, let's talk a little bit about safety, a subject we can't say enough about. Rule number 1, always remember, never loosen or tighten any valve mount, gauge, bolt, cap screw, or nut on any vessel under pressure. If you didn't already know, discharge pulsation dampeners use only one type of precharge, nitrogen. Do not use oxygen or compressed air. If it's mixed with oil or grease, it will ignite. Since you'll be pressurizing the dampener to a fairly high pressure, there's a possibility of pure oxygen finding a greased surface or your gloves. If it does, it'll burn or explode and probably take you with it. So remember, nitrogen only. Almost all of our rigs use one of two pulsation dampeners: Hydral or Continental EMSCO. They're similar in design and therefore similar in the manner in which they're serviced. Other styles are found on a small number of rigs, but because of their different design, this program will only cover Hydral and Continental EMSCO pulsation dampeners. In addition to this program, make sure you study and have handy a current service manual for the dampener you're working on. Look at these side-by-side cross-sections of the two units. This flange-type cover plate, or head, secures and seals the flexible diaphragm inside the body. The diaphragm is the only thing in the body cavity. It absorbs the mud pump pulsations as they pass through the fluid port in the bottom of the dampener. When the mud pumps are shut down, the nitrogen precharge forces the diaphragm down, which forces all remaining fluid out the fluid port. All available space is now reserved for surge displacement. The diaphragm in the Hydral unit contains a steel insert in the bottom of the diaphragm. This helps create a proper seating position and keeps the diaphragm from sticking out the fluid port. Continental EMSCO uses a perforated retainer plug over the fluid port and a slightly thicker diaphragm. This helps to serve the same function as the insert on the Hydral unit. The cover plates, or heads, are nearly identical, each with a charging valve, pressure gauge, and valve guard. On the Continental unit, the gauge and valve are mounted in a single unit, while Hydral has them mounted separately. The charging valve is where you'll bleed the pressure off, as well as administer the nitrogen precharge. Since the two units are different, have the servicing manual handy. The diaphragm of the Hydral dampener contains a diaphragm stabilizer. It attaches to the metal insert. As the insert approaches a seating position, the stabilizer stiffens the diaphragm. This assures the uniform flexing needed to control highly viscous drilling mud. The Continental unit doesn't have a stabilizer. As mentioned earlier, its diaphragm has a little thicker wall design, and this assures the uniform flexing. For the most part, pulsation dampeners are maintenance-free vessels, although they should be checked at least once a tower. Otherwise, they're so reliable you may forget they're there. The nitrogen precharge can last for years, so unless there's a leak, there's nothing to do. Now, do you remember the shaking and vibrating in the discharge pipes? That was probably caused by a drop in pressure in the pulsation dampener. The only thing that can cause a pressure drop is a leak somewhere in the unit. It could be in the charging valve, pressure gauge, the seal between the head and body, or a rupture in the diaphragm. If you suspect a leak, there's a couple of things you need to do. First, turn the mud pump off and check the pressure gauge. You can read the hydral gauge right away, but we'll have to open the valve handle on the Continental unit. Do this with the mud pump off and open the valve slowly. Stand back from the gauge a little bit. The glass has been known to blow out when pressure hits the gauge. If the pressure is low or non-existent, there's a leak. Your next step is to find out where the unit has leaked. Before assuming the diaphragm is ruptured, check the valve, gauge, and head seal with soapy water. To do this, you'll have to charge the dampener to a couple hundred psi. If there's a leak, you'll be able to see it. If you haven't already turned the mud pump off, do it now. Then, lock it out and tag it. This tells everyone you're at work. Also, make sure you tell the driller. Next, close the valve nearest to the dampener on the discharge line. This will minimize mud loss. Now you need to depressurize the dampener. Take an open-end wrench and open the valve outlet, or purge valve on the Continental. Then, open the valve by hand. It's okay to vent the nitrogen into the surrounding area, just don't directly inhale the escaping gas. Hydral recommends that the charging valve and pressure gauge be replaced every time they're removed. The reasons are simple. If the valve or gauge leak, they're faulty. If the diaphragm has ruptured, mud has clogged both the valve and gauge. In any case, in the time it takes to bleed the charge off, you should have time to find a new set. The same is true for Continental EMSCO units, so be safe. Do it the Sedco 4X way. After the dampener is depressurized, remember to double check. You're ready to repair it. The first thing you need to do on either dampener is remove the valve and gauge. Just use an open-end wrench to loosen them, then you can remove them by hand. Now you can check to see if your diaphragm has ruptured. Take a welding rod or piece of wire and stick it through the hole where the valve or gauge was. Push it until you hit the bottom of the diaphragm and move it around. Now, pull it out. If there's any mud or fluid on the end, you have a rupture. If the valve or gauge were faulty, replace them. Pre-charge the dampener, and you're ready to go. If you found a leak in the head and body seal, or a rupture in the diaphragm, it's time to move on. Now you'll have to remove the head off the dampener. Have your tools ready, like an impact wrench, open-end wrench, socket set with extensions, and so on. Also, have a new diaphragm and valve and gauge set on hand. You'll probably have to replace them all. Next, remove the head nuts. Use an impact wrench and socket or a hammer wrench. As you remove the nuts, some of the studs may come off with them. This is fine. Just lay them in a box or bucket and set them aside. This keeps them from disappearing and keeps them out of the way. Now it's time to remove the head. The simplest way is with what we'll call a Johnny arm, and it's similar to a small crane, which can also be used. To use either one, you'll have to reattach the valve guard. To use the Johnny arm, you'll have to remove a stud if one didn't already come out. Mount the Johnny arm in the empty hole, lift the cover, and swing it out of the way. If the seal between the head and body caused your leak, then make sure the diaphragm is seated properly and seals when the head is in place. You'll have to reassemble and pressurize the dampener with a small amount of pressure to check. Despite all the possibilities, the most likely source for a leak is a rupture in the diaphragm. Now comes the hard part, removing the diaphragm. If it's a hydral unit, you'll have to remove the stabilizer first. A cap screw, lock washer, and stabilizer plate hold it in place. After removing it, throw it away. Never reuse an old stabilizer with a new diaphragm. Since we're on the subject of hydral, the easiest way to remove their diaphragm is with the Johnny arm. You'll have to find an eye screw that fits the insert. Place the eye screw in the insert, hook the Johnny arm up to it, and pull it out. It'll come out wrong side out, but since you're probably throwing it away, it doesn't matter. The Continental EMSCO diaphragm is a bit harder. Since it conforms to the body and is made of pretty thick rubber, it'll be hard to get out through the neck. To remove it, push down on the side of the neck. Slide a crowbar behind it and try to pry it out. This can ruin a good diaphragm, so make sure you really need to change it before taking it out. In cold climates, you may have to cut the diaphragm to get it out. After removing the diaphragm, you'll need to clean and inspect the unit. Thoroughly clean every surface inside the dampener. Use a hose and clean all the loose mud and dirt from inside the body, the shoulder where the diaphragm seats, and around the fluid port. Also, clean surfaces on the head that come in contact with the body and diaphragm. Use a wire brush and scour the same surfaces. Make sure the shoulder seat is clean so the diaphragm will seat properly, but don't remove any metal while using the wire brush. Now, inspect all surfaces for nicks, spurs, and rough edges. If left unchecked, these can damage a new diaphragm, so check all the surfaces it will come in contact with. Use a portable grinder to smooth them down if necessary. Now, inspect the fluid ports. Look for mud cutting or corrosion. If there's excessive damage by either, let the tool pusher know. The hydral unit has a replaceable bottom plate which contains the fluid port, and the Continental unit has a replaceable retainer plug. These will have to be replaced if corrosion, like this, occurs. When your inspection is complete, you're ready to install the new diaphragm. In most instances, and especially in cold climates, you may want to warm the diaphragm up before trying to install it. Set it near a heater or wrap it in a blanket and flex it a few times. Then keep it warm until you're ready to install it. The hydral and Continental diaphragms can be installed in two ways. The first, and what Hydral believes is easiest with theirs, is to lay the diaphragm on its side and roll the bottom in on itself. Using this method, the neck opening will be on the outside. You should be able to roll it up to where it'll fit in the hole quite easily. The other method is to collapse the diaphragm at the center and fold the largest part in on itself. Roll it tightly together and put the bottom end into the neck of the dampener. You can use a rope to hold it tight when you're inserting it. Just remember to remove the rope. After getting it to conform to the shape of the body, seat the neck loosely in the shoulder. You may need some help pushing the walls out to meet the body, since a new diaphragm is pretty stiff. If yours is a hydral dampener, now's the time to install the new stabilizer. Just reverse the removal process. As you try to set the neck in the shoulder, you might want to use some dishwashing liquid. It'll help make the seal between the head and diaphragm. When you press the neck into the seating position, make sure it isn't loose and that the rib fits firmly into the shoulder with no gaps or spaces. To help create a proper seal, spread a thin layer of anti-seize on the surface where the head and body will join. You'll also need a fine bead of oil between the diaphragm lip and the seal groove on the head. If not, make sure you have at least 4 in place. Then, lower the head into position. At this point, you may want to put some anti-seize on the studs. This reduces friction when replacing the nuts, as well as protecting against corrosion. Now you can remove the johnny arm and place the remaining studs in the holes. Hand tighten the nuts first, then tighten them down in a crossing pattern with your impact or hammer wrench. Let's jump ahead to the point when you're ready to remount the gauge and charging valve. Take off the valve guard so that you can remount the gauge and charging valve. Put a layer of Teflon on the threads of the assembly and screw it in. When you tighten, make sure the face of the gauge is midway between the 2 cap screw holes where the valve guard will be mounted. That's where one opening of the valve guard will be, so you'll be able to see the gauge reading. Torque the gauge and charging valve to 20 foot-pounds. Before replacing the valve guard and completing the reassembly, you'll pressurize the dampener. Remember to pressurize with nitrogen only. First, close the charging valve on the dampener head and remove the purge valve. Attach a charging hose to the valve, making sure it's seated firmly. Next, you need to hook up a nitrogen bottle. Use a pressure regulator. It's another way to ensure that you won't overpressurize the dampener. And this is a rule of thumb. Always attach a pressure regulator to the nitrogen bottle, then attach the hose to the regulator. Never attach a pressure hose directly to the nitrogen bottle. Before you open up your nitrogen bottle, you need to know how your pressure regulator works. The gauge on the right gives you the actual pressure in the bottle, and the gauge on the left reads the output pressure from the regulator. Screw the handle clockwise and you'll increase the pressure allowed out of the bottle. Screw it counterclockwise and you will decrease the pressure. Since a fully charged nitrogen bottle reads about 3,000 psi, and the dampener precharge is less than a third of that, you can see the necessity of using a pressure regulator. And speaking of precharge, the recommended precharge is 650 psi, and it must never exceed 1,000 psi. To pressurize the dampener, open the charging valve on the dampener. Then, open the valve on the nitrogen bottle and turn the handle on the regulator to allow nitrogen into the dampener. Since you want 650 psi, that is what the gauge on the left should read. When you reach the precharge level, Close down the charging valve, regulator, and the valve on the nitrogen bottle. Now, disconnect the pressure hose from the charging valve and replace the purge valve or valve outlet. Before you remove the regulator, back off the connector to relieve the pressure in the regulator. Now do a maintenance test. For the Continental, open the dampener charging valve slowly. Look at the gauge and you'll see the pre-charge pressure in the diaphragm. Let the dampener stand like this for 15 minutes or so. In the hydral, the gauge taps directly into the pressurized space, so obviously you don't have to open the charging valve to read the pressure. After that time period, check the gauge. The pressure should not have dropped. If it did, you have a leak. Check all those areas we showed you at the beginning of the tape and find the leak. Oh, and remember, never disassemble a vessel while it's under pressure, and never tighten down a leaky vessel while it's under pressure. If you follow the procedures in this program, the dampener will pass the maintenance test. If you're working on a Continental dampener, now's the time to close the dampener charging valve tightly. Your final step? Replace the valve guard. The operation is complete. From now on, all you need to do is check the dampener pressure whenever the mud pump is shut down. Remember, on the Continental dampener, you have to open the charging valve slowly to read the gauge. It should read the proper pre-charge. Don't check the gauge while the pump is in operation. It won't give you an accurate pre-charge reading. It gets expensive when your mud pumps shake apart your discharge piping. Smooth out that bumpy road. Take charge of your Pulsation Dampner.